The snow came without warning, the way most catastrophes do in the territory of Wyoming, and Louise Bailey was standing in the doorway of the First Methodist Church of Harlan Creek when the cold hit her like a judgment from the very God she had come to beg forgiveness from. She was soaked straight through her dress, her dark hair plastered against her cheeks, her boots filled with icy water from crossing Piney Creek on foot because the buckboard that was supposed to bring her from the Dalton Ranch had never come. She was shaking so hard her teeth clicked together like she was trying to speak a language no human tongue had ever shaped, and she could not stop it, could not press her arms tight enough against her ribs to make the cold let go. And she was thinking, with the particular clarity that comes to a person standing at the absolute edge of their endurance, that she had made every single wrong choice a woman could make in the year 1879. And this howling Wyoming November was simply the universe's way of confirming what she already knew. She was not supposed to be in Harlan Creek at all. She was not supposed to be standing in any church doorway, especially not this one, especially not tonight, the night before the wedding of the man she had once believed loved her, the man whose betrayal had unraveled her life like a cheap thread pulled from a poorly stitched hem. She was here because she had nowhere else to go, because the secret she was carrying could not wait another hour, because what she knew about Fletcher Dalton and the dark past he had buried under charm and money, and a very fine mustache was going to come out at that altar tomorrow morning whether she said it out loud or not, and she would rather be the one who said it. She was still shivering, staring at the frozen mud street of Harlan Creek, watching the snow fall in thick, silent curtains across the oil lamps lining the main thoroughfare, when she heard boots on the church steps behind her. She did not turn around. The boots stopped. A pause, brief, just 2 or 3 heartbeats, and then she heard the sound of brass buttons being worked open, methodical, unhurried, and something heavy and warm settled across her shoulders before she had even registered what was happening, before she had processed anything beyond the sudden, overwhelming relief of not being cold anymore. She turned then. The man standing behind her was already pulling the lapels of the coat closed around her shoulders, his big hands adjusting the collar so it covered the back of her neck, and he had not yet looked at her face. He was tall, with the kind of lean, hard build that came from actual work and not from posturing, and his dark coat was now on her back, and he was standing in shirt sleeves in a Wyoming November blizzard without flinching. When he finally lifted his eyes to hers, they were gray, the particular gray of a sky right before lightning, and they were looking at her with a directness that made her want to step backward into the church. He said, "You looked cold," she said. "I am cold." "I know," he said. "That is why I gave you the coat." She should have handed it back. She should have said thank you, turned away, gone inside to wait for Pastor Garfield to finish locking up the vestry so she could tell him what she knew about Fletcher Dalton before she lost her nerve entirely. Instead, she stood there in the doorway of First Methodist with a stranger's coat around her wet shoulders and looked at him. And something in the way he was looking back at her felt like the first honest thing that had happened to her in longer than she could easily calculate. "Louise Bailey," she said, because it seemed important that he know who she was before he decided whether to keep standing there. "Clyde Alden," he said. He did not extend his hand for a shake, not because he was rude, but because his hands were still adjusting the coat around her, and he did not seem to think it made sense to stop something useful in order to do something ceremonial. She would think about that moment for a very long time afterward. The coat around her shoulders. The unhurried, functional kindness of it. How he had already been unbuttoning it before she noticed, which meant he had been watching her shiver for some seconds before he moved, long enough to decide, not long enough to hesitate, but to understand what came next, and what came before, and why that moment in the church doorway was both an ending and a beginning. You have to understand how Louise Bailey came to be standing in the cold in the first place. Louise had arrived in Harlan Creek, Wyoming Territory, 7 months earlier, in the first week of April, 1879, stepping off the Cheyenne and Northern stage with a carpetbag in one hand and a folded letter in the other. The letter was from a man named Fletcher Dalton, who had placed an advertisement in the St. Louis Dispatch the previous January seeking a woman of good character and practical skills to serve as schoolteacher in the new settlement of Harlan Creek, room and board provided, salary of $18 per month, references required. The advertisement had said nothing about romance. Fletcher Dalton had managed to introduce romance anyway, with a speed and confidence that Louise, 24 years old and possessed of enough book learning to know better, had found genuinely dazzling. She had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a county clerk who believed fiercely in public education and died of a fever when Louise was 17, leaving her with a library of 200 books, a talent for mathematics that impressed and occasionally alarmed the men around her, and no inheritance to speak of. She had spent the years between 17 and 24 teaching at a series of increasingly remote schoolhouses, following the rail lines west, because the West was always willing to hire a woman who could teach, and was not particular about sleeping arrangements or the quality of the stove. Fletcher Dalton was 35, handsome in the polished, deliberate way of a man who spent time in front of a mirror, and he owned the largest cattle operation in the Harlan Creek Valley, which meant he owned, indirectly, approximately everything else of consequence in a 40-mile radius. He had been charming to Louise from the first afternoon she stepped off the stage, meeting her himself rather than sending a hand, carrying her bag to the boarding house run by Mrs. Eugenia Holt, buying her supper at the hotel dining room, asking her questions about Missouri and her father, and what she thought of Emerson's essays with the ease of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through the application of attention. She had been charmed. She would admit that freely, even now, standing in the snow with a stranger's coat on her back. She had been charmed, and she had been lonely, and those two things together are a combination that has unraveled wiser people than Louise Bailey. By June, she had agreed to a courtship. By August, Fletcher had spoken to her about marriage, not as a proposal exactly, more as an assumption they had arrived at together, the way one arrives at a conclusion in mathematics, and she had not corrected the assumption. She had told herself she loved him. She had believed herself when she said it, which is possibly the most dangerous kind of lie. What she had not known in April or June or August was that Fletcher Dalton had a wife, not a dead wife. Not a wife from whom he was legally separated under the laws of any applicable territory. A living, breathing, entirely real wife named Alma, who had grown up in Laramie and married Fletcher Dalton in the spring of 1872 at the age of 19, and who had been living quietly in the eastern half of the Dalton Ranch property in a small house that Fletcher referred to, when he referred to it at all, as the old foreman's quarters. He had told anyone who asked that Alma was his cousin, staying on account of family obligation. He had told Alma, Louise would learn much later, that he was only keeping up appearances, that the marriage had been a mistake, that he was working on a legal remedy that took time in the territories, that she should be patient. He had told Louise nothing at all. Louise found out in the way that most hidden things reveal themselves, not through any dramatic confrontation or deliberate investigation, but through an accidental collision of ordinary circumstances. She had been walking the long way back from the schoolhouse on an October afternoon, following the creek path that cut through the eastern edge of the Dalton property, when she came around a stand of cottonwoods and nearly walked directly into a woman hanging laundry on a line strung between two pines. The woman was perhaps 26, with reddish hair and dark-circled eyes and the particular look of someone who has been crying on and off for so long that her face has simply accepted it as a permanent condition. They had stared at each other. The woman said, "You are the teacher." It was not a question. Louise said, "Yes, I am sorry, I did not mean to trespass, I was just following the creek path." The woman said, "I know who you are. I am Alma Dalton." She paused, watching Louise's face work through the information. His wife, she added, with a gentleness that was somehow worse than accusation would have been. I thought he would have told you by now. He has been meaning to, I think. He is always meaning to. Louise stood in the golden October light among the cottonwoods and understood that she had been made a fool of in a very thorough way, and that the man responsible was currently planning their wedding for the spring, and that there was a woman standing in front of her who had been wronged far more completely and for far longer, and that the entire situation was a betrayal so layered it was almost architectural. She had not gone back to the Dalton ranch that evening. She had gone back to Mrs. Holt's boarding house, sat on the edge of her bed with her hands folded in her lap, and thought very carefully for a very long time about what she was going to do. She had thought about leaving Harlan Creek entirely. She had enough money saved from 7 months of salary to get herself as far as Denver. She could find another school. She could simply disappear from Fletcher Dalton's life the way women were expected to disappear when a situation became inconvenient, quietly and without making trouble. She had rejected that option because of Alma. Alma had not asked for Louise's help. Alma had not, in that brief conversation among the cottonwoods, said anything beyond the bare facts of the situation, offered with that terrible gentleness. But Louise had thought about Alma for 3 weeks after that meeting, thought about her while teaching long division and American history and penmanship to the 12 children of Harlan Creek. And the more she thought about her, the angrier she got, not at Alma, but at the architecture of the whole arrangement, the way Fletcher had been able to build an entire false structure of courtship and assumed future on the foundation of Alma's invisible suffering, the way his hidden motive had been to simply keep accumulating. Wife and land and cattle and schoolteacher, as if the world were a catalog from which a man of sufficient means could order anything he pleased. So she had not left. She had instead spent the next 3 weeks gathering information with the quiet efficiency of a woman who teaches mathematics, and therefore understands that the best argument is a provable one. She had talked to Reverend Silas Garfield, the pastor of First Methodist, under the guise of asking about the church's record-keeping, and had confirmed that no marriage between Louise Bailey and Fletcher Dalton had yet been recorded, which meant she had not been legally trapped into anything, only morally deceived. She had talked to Eugenia Holt, who, it turned out, had known about Alma for years and said so with considerable relief at finally being able to say it to someone directly. She had written a letter to the county clerk's office in Laramie and received back confirmation that a marriage record between Fletcher James Dalton and Alma Rose Whitfield existed and had not been dissolved, and she had made a decision. She was going to the church the night before Fletcher's planned wedding, the wedding he had been quietly planning to a woman named Carrie Marsh who had arrived from Nebraska in September with no idea, as far as Louise could tell, that she was walking into the same trap Louise had narrowly escaped, and she was going to lay all of it out for Pastor Garfield before the ceremony, every fact she had gathered, every document she could produce. Because she was not going to let Carrie Marsh walk into that church tomorrow morning and have her life arranged, and then disarranged by Fletcher Dalton's dark past and hidden motives. That was what she had been trying to do when the buckboard failed to come, and when the snow started, and when she crossed Piney Creek on foot in the November dark and arrived at the church doorway soaked and shaking and barely holding herself together. And that was the state she was in when Clyde Alden appeared at the top of the church steps and was already unbuttoning his coat before she noticed. Clyde Alden had been in Harlan Creek for exactly 9 days when he met Louise Bailey in the church doorway, which was not long enough for him to know much about the town, but was long enough for him to know that something was badly wrong with the way it was run. He had come from Laramie, where he had spent 4 years working as a deputy sheriff before the sheriff he worked under was replaced by a political appointee who owed Fletcher Dalton several substantial favors, and the new administration made it clear very quickly that a deputy with Clyde's particular habit of following the law regardless of whose interests it complicated was not going to find the arrangement comfortable. He was 29 years old, had been born in Ohio, had come west at 19 with the particular combination of restlessness and principle that characterized a certain type of young man from the post-war generation, and had discovered that he was very good at the work of keeping order, but that keeping order in the West was not always the same thing as keeping the law, and the distinction mattered enormously to him. He had come to Harlan Creek following a thread. In his 4 years as a Laramie deputy, he had accumulated a considerable file, in his own private record-keeping, on Fletcher Dalton, who had a long history of acquiring land and cattle and contracts through methods that were rarely illegal on their face, but had a consistent texture of coercion underneath, a pattern of applying the right pressure to the right person at the right moment to produce outcomes that served Fletcher Dalton's interests at the cost of someone else's ability to resist. There were homestead families who had sold their land to Dalton at distressed prices and then left the territory. There was the matter of a water rights dispute in '76 that had ended with the opposing party's barn burning down and no charges ever filed. There was the marriage record in Laramie, which Clyde had noticed because a Laramie deputy notices most documents that pass through the county clerk's office, and which had struck him as odd 3 years later when someone mentioned in passing that Fletcher Dalton was courting the new schoolteacher over in Harlan Creek. He had come to Harlan Creek with no official authority and no specific plan beyond watching and listening, because sometimes watching and listening was enough. He had taken a room at the hotel, introduced himself as a former lawman looking for ranch work, and spent 9 days observing the social architecture of the town, with the patience of a man who understood that the most important information is usually the information that no one thinks to hide because no one thinks anyone is looking. On the 9th day, he had been walking back from the livery stable in the early evening when the snow started, and he had pulled his collar up and kept walking, and he had seen a figure at the church doorway that resolved, as he got closer, into a young woman who was so thoroughly wet and so violently shaking that he had felt, before he had even consciously decided to feel anything, a sharp alarm in the vicinity of his chest. He did not think of himself as a particularly impulsive man. He thought of himself as deliberate, practical, someone who acted when action was called for and waited when waiting was called for, and the space between those two states was navigated by judgment and not by feeling. But he had been working his coat buttons before he reached the top of the church steps, before he had even gotten a clear look at her face, which was, if he was being honest with himself, the kind of thing that should have told him something. "You looked cold," he had said, because he was not a man who dressed things up unnecessarily. And she had said, "I am cold," and looked at him with dark eyes that were still trying to be steady even though the rest of her was shaking, and something in him recognized something in her, the particular look of a person who is holding themselves together through sheer force of decision, and not because they have anything left to spare, and he had thought with a clarity that surprised him, "This woman is trying to do something important, and she needs to not die of cold first." He said, "Is there somewhere warm you can go? You cannot stay in this doorway," she said. "I need to speak with Pastor Garfield. Tonight." "Tonight," she said, with a firmness that answered several questions about the importance of what she was trying to do. He said, "Then let us go inside and find him." She looked at him for a moment as if she were calculating something. He could see her doing it, the assessment direct and quick, and he let her do it, which seemed to be the right response, because after a moment she nodded and turned and went inside, and he followed. The interior of First Methodist Church was not warm exactly, but it was significantly warmer than the doorway, and the wood stove at the back had been banked low, producing enough heat to make the difference between staying alive and not. Louise moved toward it immediately and stood with her back to it, pulling his coat tighter around herself, and Clyde found Pastor Garfield in the vestry at the back of the church, a small man with a fringe of white hair and the startled expression of someone who had not expected company. "Miss Bailey," Garfield said, coming into the nave and seeing Louise by the stove. Good heavens, what happened to you? The buckboard did not come, Louise said. I walked. I need to tell you something, Pastor, and it cannot wait until morning. Garfield looked at Clyde. Clyde said, I found her in the doorway. I do not know who she is or what her business is, and if you want me to step outside, I will. Louise said, Stay. He looked at her surprised. She said, What I am about to tell the pastor is not a secret. It is a fact that deserves to be known, and I would rather have a witness. So Clyde Alden stood by the back wall of First Methodist Church in Harlan Creek, Wyoming Territory, on a November evening in 1879, and listened to Louise Bailey lay out, in precise and documented detail, the entire history of Fletcher Dalton's deception. She presented it the way she probably taught mathematics, he thought, building from established fact to established fact, citing her sources, producing from the carpetbag she had carried across the creek in the dark, a folded copy of the Laramie marriage record, a letter from Eugenia Holt confirming Alma's presence on the Dalton property, and a timeline she had written out in a schoolteacher's clear, careful hand showing every overlap between Fletcher's courtship of Louise and his continued legal marriage to Alma, and now the planned wedding to Carrie Marsh. Garfield sat very still through all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Miss Bailey, do you understand what Fletcher Dalton will do when he finds out you have brought this to me? She said. I have thought about that, Garfield said. He will not be pleased. Clyde said from the back wall. He will try to discredit her. Both of them looked at him. He said, Forgive me, but a man like Dalton, when he is cornered, does not confess. He attacks the credibility of whoever has cornered him. Miss Bailey should know that. Louise turned back to Garfield. I know that. It does not change what is true, and it does not change what I have here. She tapped the documents on the pew beside her. This is real. The marriage record is real. Alma Dalton is real. Carrie Marsh deserves to know before she walks into that church tomorrow, Garfield said heavily. I cannot perform a marriage that I know to be invalid. You have my word on that. Louise let out a breath, slow and quiet, and Clyde saw some of the rigid tension in her shoulders release, just slightly. Thank you, she said. Garfield said he would make arrangements to speak with Carrie Marsh first thing in the morning, before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. He said he would also need to consider how to handle the notification of the relevant authorities regarding Fletcher Dalton's situation, which was a delicate way of saying that bigamy was a crime, and the documentation Louise had brought him made a fairly compelling case for it. He said Louise should stay the night at the boarding house and not go back to the Dalton ranch. Louise said she had already moved her belongings to Mrs. Holt's. She had done it that afternoon, which told Clyde she had been planning this for some time and had not come to the church on an impulse. Garfield saw them both to the door, thanked Clyde for getting her in out of the cold, and went back inside to do whatever pastors do when they have been handed a difficult morning. Clyde and Louise stood on the church steps. The snow was still coming down, heavy and quiet, and the street of Harlan Creek was almost beautiful in it, all its roughness smoothed over white. Louise was still wearing his coat. She seemed to realize this and began shrugging it off. He said, Keep it until you get to the boarding house. She paused. That is 2 blocks. It is cold, he said. She looked at him again with that direct, calculating look. You are a former lawman, she said. Why are you in Harlan Creek? He said. Fletcher Dalton. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Not for me, you understand. I just want to know. I know, he said. Not for you. I have been building a record on Dalton for 3 years. Land fraud, water rights coercion, a barn fire that was never properly investigated. The bigamy is the most straightforwardly criminal piece of it, and you have done a better job of documenting it in 3 weeks than I managed in 3 years from Laramie. She said, I teach mathematics, I understand evidence. He almost smiled and was slightly surprised by the impulse. I noticed, he said. She pulled the coat tighter around herself and looked at the snow-covered street, and he could see her processing the information, adding it to whatever calculation she was already running. So you have no official standing, she said. You cannot arrest him. No, but the county sheriff in Laramie has standing, And if I bring him what you have brought Pastor Garfield tonight, along with the rest of what I have documented, he has an obligation to act, even if Dalton has friends on the force." "Even if," she said, and the two words carried a very specific weight, the weight of someone who understood exactly what it meant to rely on institutional obligation in a place where personal interest regularly overrode it. "Even if," he agreed. "It is not certain, but it is real. What you did tonight was real," she said. "It was the only thing to do." They stood in silence for a moment, snow falling around them, the oil lamps casting orange circles on the white street. And then she said good night and turned and walked toward Mrs. Holt's boarding house, still wearing his coat. He watched her go, and something in him noted the straight line of her back and the deliberate firmness of each step in the snow. And he thought that he had not met many people, man or woman, with that particular combination of intelligence and moral seriousness, and the physical courage to cross a creek in a blizzard to do the right thing. He stood on the church steps for a while after she was gone, his shirt sleeves cold and his mind considerably busier than it had been an hour before. The next morning was clear and sharp, the snow having stopped sometime in the early hours, leaving Harlan Creek encased in a brilliant, painful white. Clyde was at the hotel dining room at 7 in the morning when he heard the first sounds of the confrontation from 3 blocks away, which told him that whatever Pastor Garfield had said to Carrie Marsh, and whatever Carrie Marsh had said to Fletcher Dalton, the results were not quiet. He was out the door and moving before his coffee had cooled. The confrontation was on the main street, in front of the church, because of course it was, because Fletcher Dalton was not the kind of man who took bad news to a private room and processed it privately. He was standing in the snow-packed street in his wedding finery, a dark coat and a very fine waistcoat, looking like what he was, which was a man who had expected a very different morning, and he was red-faced and speaking in a carrying voice to Pastor Garfield, who was standing in the church doorway with an expression of composed determination. Behind Fletcher, at a cautious distance, were several of his ranch hands, men who had ridden into town for what they had expected to be a celebration. Carrie Marsh was not there. Someone had apparently had the good sense to take her somewhere else while the scene on the street played out. Louise was there. She was standing to the side of the church steps, not in the center of the confrontation, but not hidden either, and she was wearing a blue wool dress that was not as warm as his coat, which she had returned the previous night via Mrs. Holt's daughter, and she was watching Fletcher Dalton with an expression that was not gloating and not afraid, and not anything so simple as either of those things. It was the expression of someone who has done what they decided to do and is now in the part where the world responds. Clyde positioned himself at the edge of the gathering crowd, watching. Fletcher Dalton spotted Louise. His face went through a rapid sequence of expressions, anger, then calculation, then a kind of cold composure that was, to Clyde's experienced eye, more dangerous than the anger. He said, "Louise, I should have known." She said, "Good morning, Fletcher." He said, "Do you understand what you have done? Do you understand what this will mean for you in this town?" She said, "I understand what a marriage record from Laramie means. I expect you understand it too." Fletcher's eyes moved past her and found Clyde, which was interesting, because it suggested Fletcher knew who Clyde was, or at least had been told enough about the former Laramie deputy to make an identification. His expression tightened. He said to no one in particular and to everyone, "This is a conspiracy against me. This woman and this man have colluded to destroy my reputation and disrupt my family's affairs. I will not stand for it." Garfield said from the church doorway with the calm of a man who has committed to a position and is not moving, "Fletcher, there is a marriage record. I cannot perform this ceremony. Those are the facts." Fletcher looked at Garfield, and then at the crowd, and then at Louise again, and something shifted in his face, the performance of injured dignity giving way for just a moment to something rower and uglier. "You will regret this," he said, and it was directed at Louise, not at Garfield, not at the crowd. Clyde moved. He crossed the distance between himself and Louise in about 6 steps, and put himself not in front of her, because she had not asked him to protect her, and he did not think she needed protecting in the sense of a physical threat in broad daylight in the middle of town, but beside her, close enough that Fletcher and everyone watching understood the geometry. Louise looked at him with surprise and then with something that was not quite surprise. Fletcher said to Clyde, "Mind your business, lawman." Clyde said, "I am not a lawman right now. I am standing next to a woman who just did something courageous and correct, and I am doing it so you know she is not alone." Fletcher stared at him. The crowd was very quiet. Then Fletcher turned and walked back toward his men and the horses that were hitched in front of the saloon, and the crowd parted for him, and the morning went back to the sounds of winter, wind and snow settling, and the distant complaint of a horse. Louise said, quietly beside Clyde, "I did not need rescuing." He said equally quietly, "I know, that was not rescuing, that was choosing a side." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Thank you." The days following the disrupted wedding were not easy ones in Harlan Creek, and Clyde would not have described them as easy, but they had a quality he had not expected, a kind of motion, a sense of the town working through something and coming out the other side slightly different. Fletcher Dalton retreated to his ranch and spent several days not being seen, which the town interpreted in various ways, none of them charitable. Carrie Marsh, it emerged, had family in Nebraska and had decided to return to them, which seemed like the wisest possible decision, and which Louise and Mrs. Holt helped facilitate with some discreet assistance covering the cost of the stage fare. Alma Dalton, whom Clyde drove out to see with a copy of the relevant documents and a very careful conversation about her legal options, turned out to be considerably more resilient than her dark-circled eyes had suggested, and she asked several sharp questions about property rights that indicated she had been thinking about her situation for some time and needed only the information, not the encouragement. Clyde sent a full report and document packet to the Laramie County Sheriff on a Tuesday and spent the rest of that week watching the town's social atmosphere shift in small, definitive ways. People who had been deferential to Fletcher Dalton began to be less so. The homesteading families who had sold their land at distressed prices began, cautiously, to talk to each other. The water rights dispute from '76 was mentioned in the hotel dining room by a rancher named Hicks, who had previously been very careful not to mention it anywhere. Louise kept teaching school. He started seeing her in the morning sometimes, walking to the schoolhouse with her carpetbag and her straight back and her purposeful stride, and he made a habit of finding reasons to be on that side of town in the morning, not following her, but moving through the same space, and occasionally they would fall into step together for half a block or a block, talking about things that were both practical and interesting, the weather, the political situation in the territory, a book she was teaching to the older students, a legal question he had about the water rights situation that her mathematical mind turned out to be very useful in approaching. He noticed that she laughed sometimes, unexpectedly, at things he said, a quick, genuine laugh that she did not seem to have planned for, and that made her look startled for just a moment before she let it happen. He noticed that she talked with her hands when she was explaining something she found interesting. He noticed that she drank her coffee black, and that she had opinions about almost everything, and that she stated those opinions without prefacing them with apologies or softening them with excessive qualifications, which he found, after years of navigating around indirect communication in professional settings, genuinely and profoundly refreshing. He noticed, more slowly and with the deliberate caution of a man who had been careful about noticing things for a long time, that he was looking forward to the mornings. Louise was noticing things too, though she was doing it, as she did most things, analytically. She noticed that Clyde Alden was a man who did what he said he was going to do, which was rarer than it should have been. He had said he would send the report to Laramie, and he had sent it. He had said he would find a way to have a legal conversation with Alma about her options, and he had done it. He had said, the night in the church, that he would stay if she wanted a witness, and he had stayed, and he had not interpreted staying as permission to take over the situation, which was the particular distinction that mattered. She noticed that he was quiet in a way that was not emptiness. Most quiet men she had encountered were quiet because they had nothing particular to say or because they had learned that saying little protected them from commitment. Clyde was quiet the way a room full of organized books is quiet, everything in it present and available, just not making noise about it. She noticed that she was noticing things, which was its own piece of information. She was careful with herself about it, careful in the way that a person who has recently been deceived learns to be careful, not cold, not closed, but slow. She had thought she loved Fletcher Dalton, and the memory of that error was not punishment exactly. It was more like a calibration instrument, a reminder that feeling certain was not the same as being right, and that a man's ability to make you feel attended to was not the same as his actual honesty. But Clyde was not Fletcher. She understood the distinction more clearly each time she thought about it. Fletcher's attentiveness had always had a quality of performance, had always been angled slightly toward her response, checking to see if the charm was landing, adjusting accordingly. Clyde's attention had a different quality. It was directed at the actual content of what she was saying and not at his own effect on her. When he disagreed with her, which was not infrequent, because they were both people with opinions and the territory provided ample subjects for disagreement, he said so directly and gave his reasoning, and then he listened to her response without the performance of a man who is waiting to be convinced, but with the actual engagement of someone who might change his mind if the argument was good enough. He had changed his mind, twice, in conversations she could specify exactly. Once about the optimal strategy for presenting the water rights documentation to the Laramie sheriff, where she had made a mathematical argument about the order of evidence presentation that he had initially resisted, and then agreed with and implemented. Once about whether the homesteading families should be encouraged to pursue their claims individually or collectively, where she had argued for collectively, drawing on her knowledge of the relevant precedents, and he had, after a day of thinking about it, said she was right. She was, after 6 weeks of this, in a state she recognized as the beginning of something she was not yet ready to name. It was Mrs. Holt who named it for her, because Mrs. Holt had been watching people fall in love for 40 years and had developed the ability to identify it from some distance with impressive accuracy. She said, on a Wednesday morning in December, setting a plate of biscuits on the boarding house breakfast table, "That Alden man looks at you the way a man looks at a woman he is trying not to look at too much." Louise said, "Eugenia, I am eating breakfast." Mrs. Holt said, "So am I. I am also telling you something true." Louise said, "He is a decent man who has been helpful during a difficult time." Mrs. Holt said, "He also spent 45 minutes yesterday helping your youngest student, that Hicks boy, with his reading, during which time he was sitting directly in front of the schoolhouse window that faces the main street, and he was doing it without being asked, which tells me he found out the Hicks boy was struggling from you, and that he went and sat in that window on purpose." Louise was quiet. "Men who are just being helpful," Mrs. Holt said, "do not do unnecessary things in front of windows." Louise thought about this for the rest of the day. She thought about it while she taught long division to 8-year-olds and American history to 12-year-olds and grammar to the whole mixed group on a cold December afternoon, with the stove working hard and the snow tapping at the schoolhouse windows. She thought about it walking home, and she thought about it through supper, and she was still thinking about it that evening when there was a knock at the boarding house door, and Mrs. Holt opened it, and Clyde was there with his hat in his hands and a covered dish that turned out to be a beef stew he had apparently made in the hotel kitchen because he had asked the cook if he could use the stove. He said, "Mrs. Holt, I wondered if you might let me have 5 minutes with Miss Bailey, if it is convenient." Mrs. Holt took the beef stew with an expression of great satisfaction and went to the kitchen, and Louise came to the door, and they stood in the doorway of the boarding house in the cold December night, and she thought, with a clarity that felt like mathematics resolving into a final answer, "Here," he said, "I have something to tell you. I got a letter from Laramie today. The county sheriff has opened a formal investigation into Fletcher Dalton. The bigamy charge is solid. The land fraud is being looked into. He is not going to be able to continue operating the way he has been." She said, "That is good news." He said, "Yes." He turned his hat in his hands. "I also have something to ask you, and I want to ask it plainly because I think you prefer plain." She said, "I do." He said, "I have been in Harlan Creek for 6 weeks, and my original reason for coming is being handled now by people with proper authority to handle it. I have no particular reason to stay except that I find I want to. I want to know if that matters to you." She looked at him for a long moment. The December night was very cold and very clear, and the stars over Harlan Creek were the stars of high Wyoming, enormous and close in the way they only are at altitude, and she thought about the coat around her shoulders in the church doorway, and the way he had said you looked cold as if it were a simple fact, and the response to a simple fact was obvious. She said, "It matters to me." He did not lean in immediately, which she appreciated. He said, "I should tell you something else. I intend to settle here. I have been speaking with the county about the possibility of a marshal's position for Harlan Creek, because the town needs one and I am qualified and I think I would do it honestly, which is a less common combination than it should be. But if you wanted me to stay for a reason other than the job, I wanted you to know the job is also a reason so that you can calculate everything accurately." She said, "You are explaining your reason so I have complete information." He said, "Yes." She said, "Clyde." He said, "Yes," she said, "ask the direct question. We both know what it is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "May I take you to supper tomorrow? Not as the person who found you in the doorway or the former deputy who helped with the legal situation. As someone who would like to know you better." She said, "Yes." He nodded once, a small, self-contained nod, the nod of a man who has gotten the answer he hoped for and is taking it quietly. He put his hat back on. He said good night and turned and walked back through the snow toward the hotel. Louise stood in the doorway of the boarding house and watched him go, and something in her chest felt like a window being opened in a warm room, the initial cold of the outside air, and then the understanding that the air is fresh, that the room needed it. Mrs. Holt appeared behind her shoulder with a cup of coffee and said, "Well," Louise said, "we are having supper tomorrow." Mrs. Holt said, "I knew it when he handed me that stew," and went back to the kitchen sounding deeply satisfied. They had supper the next evening at the hotel dining room, which was the finest eating establishment in Harlan Creek, which was not saying an enormous amount, but it had white tablecloths and a cook who knew what to do with a piece of beef, and they sat across from each other in the amber lamplight and talked for 2 hours without difficulty, moving from topic to topic with the ease of people who had been accumulating material for a conversation longer than the conversation itself. She told him about her father, about the library of 200 books, about the particular loneliness of being a girl who preferred mathematics to embroidery in a time and place that was not sure what to do with that. He told her about Ohio, about coming west, about the years in Laramie, and what he had learned about the difference between law as a text and justice as a practice, about the barn fire in '76 that he could never prove but had never stopped thinking about. They talked about the territory and the land and the strange, raw beauty of Wyoming in winter and the strange, raw beauty of a place still in the process of becoming itself. They talked until the cook put out the kitchen lanterns, and the dining room manager gave them a look of polite but definitive intention, and then they walked back through the cold night to Mrs. Holt's, and on the boarding house porch Clyde held her hand for a moment, just briefly, his hand warm and deliberate around hers, and said good night. She went inside and sat on her bed and held the hand he had held, as if it had become a slightly different hand, and thought that perhaps she had made exactly one right choice since arriving in Harlan Creek, and that choice was not leaving. December became January, and January in Wyoming Territory was a serious proposition, the kind of cold that makes choices for you, and the town of Harlan Creek pulled inward the way small frontier settlements do in deep winter. The streets quieter, the houses warmer, the social life condensed into the church and the hotel and the boarding houses, and the handful of families whose homes were warm enough to host visitors. Clyde had taken the marshal's position. He had a small office on the main street, with a wood stove and a desk, and a set of very plain curtains that Louise replaced with better ones in January, because she walked past the office one morning and looked in and found the original curtains aesthetically distressing in a way she could not justify ignoring. He had laughed when he came back to the office and found the new ones, a real laugh, full and unguarded, and it was the first time she had heard that particular sound from him, and it affected her in a way she found interesting to examine. He was a good marshal. Harlan Creek was, in most respects, a peaceable enough town, its criminal ambitions limited to the occasional drunk and the persistent small-scale dispute over fencing and water. But there was an atmosphere that developed once the town had a marshal who was known to be honest and known to follow through. A relaxation, a sense of the social contract being enforceable, that Louise recognized as genuinely important. People who had been quietly afraid of the consequences of crossing Fletcher, Dalton, began to breathe differently. Fletcher himself was still on the ranch, technically, but the investigation from Laramie had arrived in the form of a deputy and then a county attorney, and the charges were formal now. Bigamy on the solid evidence Louise had provided, and a fraud investigation that was still ongoing but had enough preliminary evidence to make his position uncomfortable. He had attempted, in the early weeks, to continue to project his usual authority, but a man who is under criminal investigation and whose social position in a small town has been publicly complicated loses that authority quickly. And by February, he had the particular look of someone who is beginning to understand that the world is not going to return to the shape it was before. Alma had made contact with a lawyer in Laramie through correspondence Clyde had helped facilitate, and was pursuing the question of her property rights with the focused intensity of a woman who had been waiting years for the opportunity. This was not a quick or simple process, because property rights for married women in Wyoming Territory were governed by the Married Women's Property Act of 1869, which was actually more progressive than most of the country, but applying it in a situation as complicated as Alma's required time and patience and a good lawyer. Clyde and Louise followed the case together, Louise because it was the right thing to follow and Clyde because he had been professionally invested in the situation since before he arrived in Harlan Creek. The following of it together, the shared attention to a serious matter, deepened something between them that was already deepening on its own. On a Saturday in February, Clyde took her riding. She had mentioned once that she missed being able to ride regularly, that she had ridden every day as a child in Missouri, and that the transition to town life made it difficult to do, and he had appeared on a Saturday morning with 2 horses from the livery, and told her they were going up the creek valley if she was willing, because the valley was beautiful in the winter and she should see it before the snow changed. The valley was beautiful. The cottonwoods were silver against the white hills, the creek running dark between its ice-edged banks, the mountains in the distance enormous and absolute. They rode for 3 hours through the cold, clear day, talking sometimes and sometimes not talking, and the not talking was the same quality of presence as the talking, comfortable without strain. On the way back, following the creek path through the cottonwoods, he brought his horse close to hers and said, "Louise." She looked at him. He said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it while we are outside because it is easier to say things outside." She said, "All right." He said, "I have not been in love since I was 22, and that ended badly, and I spent a long time after it deciding that the practical thing was to concentrate on the work and let the other thing alone. I was very successful at it for 7 years, she said. And now, he said, and now I am in Harlan Creek, and I have found that being very successful at letting the other thing alone is substantially harder than it was before I met you. She looked at him for a moment, the horses walking slow through the blue winter shadows of the cottonwoods, and she said, I am not going to be easy. He said, I did not ask for easy. She said, I have been deceived by someone I trusted. That changes a person. Not toward bitterness, I hope, but toward carefulness. I will be careful with you for a long time. He said, I know. I am also a careful person. We will be careful together. She said, that is a practical proposal. He said, I am a practical person, but I am also, in this particular case, a person who is telling you that he is in love with you, which is less practical, and I am doing it anyway. The cottonwoods were very still and very silver around them, and the creek was dark and cold, and the mountains were enormous at the end of the valley, and Louise Bailey looked at Clyde Alden on his borrowed horse in the February afternoon, and thought about the coat in the church doorway, and the way he had been already unbuttoning it before she noticed, and thought about the new curtains and the beef stew, and the mathematics of evidence and the hand held briefly on a cold porch, and thought that the most important thing was not whether this was certain, because nothing was certain, but whether it was true. She said, I love you too. I have been working up to saying it for several weeks. He looked at her with the gray eyes and the contained expression that she had learned in 4 months to read quite well, and she could see in it the thing he was not performing, the thing that was simply there, and it was warm. He said, several weeks. She said, I am careful. I mentioned that. He said, you did. He brought his horse alongside hers and leaned across and kissed her very gently, there in the Cottonwood Valley with the snow and the mountains and the dark creek. And she kissed him back, and the cold air was around them, and the warmth was between them, and it felt like the most honest thing that had happened to either of them in a very long time. They rode back to Harlan Creek in the blue afternoon light, talking about ordinary things with the ease of people who have said the important thing and are now free to be easy with each other. And when they returned the horses to the livery and walked back toward the main street, they were walking close enough that their shoulders touched, and they did not move apart. Spring came to Harlan Creek slowly, the way spring always comes to Wyoming, reluctantly and in fits and starts. A warm week in March followed by a hard freeze, the snow retreating from the southern slopes and holding stubbornly in the draws and the north-facing coulees. The mud season was April, deep and unpleasant and unavoidable. The main street of Harlan Creek, a serious hazard for anyone in good boots, and then May arrived properly, and the cottonwoods went green overnight, and the creek valley turned a color of young green that was almost painful in its freshness after the long winter. In March, the county attorney had filed formal charges against Fletcher Dalton on the bigamy count. The trial was scheduled for the first week of June in Laramie, and Louise had been asked to appear as a witness, which she had agreed to without hesitation. Clyde would be there as well, to present the documentation of the broader pattern of fraud and coercion. It was, in the legal calculus of Wyoming Territory in 1879, a significant case, not just for what it meant for Alma Dalton's property rights and Carrie Marsh's avoided disaster, but for what it represented about whether certain forms of systematic deception had consequences. In April, while the mud was at its worst and the town was in the irritable, transitional state that mud season produces, Clyde asked Louise to marry him. He did it on the schoolhouse porch in the late afternoon after the children had gone home, which she would later identify as characteristically Clyde. The schoolhouse was hers, and the late afternoon was the time of day that was hers after the work, and doing it there and then was a kind of acknowledgement of those things. He said, I want to be very clear about what I am asking. I am asking if you want to build a life with me in Harlan Creek, knowing that I am a marshal's salary man with no family money and some strong opinions about law enforcement, and knowing that I am not going to stop saying what I think simply because it is occasionally inconvenient, and knowing that I would like to grow old with you if you are willing. She said, "That is a very specific proposal." He said, "I told you I was practical." She said, "You also said in February that you were doing the impractical thing anyway." He said, "Love and marriage are different proposals. Love can be impractical. Marriage should be considered clearly." She said, "Clyde." He said, "Yes." She said, "Yes." To all of it. The salary and the opinions and growing old and all of it. Yes. He took a small ring box from his coat pocket. He had ordered the ring from a jeweler in Cheyenne through the mail, which had taken most of March. It was a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone, the kind of ring that was not a piece of extravagance but was a very considered choice, the turquoise the particular blue-green of the Wyoming sky on a clear day. She put it on her finger and held her hand up in the late afternoon light, and it was exactly right. He said, "Is it what you wanted?" She said, "It is exactly what I wanted, and I did not know until I saw it." He smiled at her, a full smile, unguarded, and she thought she would like to spend the next several decades being the person who produced that smile on a regular basis. They were married in June, 1 week after the Laramie trial and 2 days after returning to Harlan Creek. The timing was deliberate, because Louise had not wanted the wedding to be caught up in the trial, had wanted it to exist in a completely separate space, not defined by Fletcher Dalton or anything connected to him. The trial itself had gone as the evidence suggested it should. The bigamy conviction was swift, the sentence a year in the territorial prison and a substantial fine. The fraud investigation had produced a civil judgment that put significant portions of the Dalton property under legal question, and Alma's lawyer had used the disruption to press her property claim with excellent results. Alma had come to Louise on a Thursday in May and thanked her. It had been a brief conversation, composed and direct, Alma with her reddish hair and her dark-circled eyes that were slightly less dark-circled than they had been in October, and she had said, "I know you did what you did for your own reasons and not for me, but it mattered to me more than I can say easily. I want you to know that." Louise had said, "I hope you will be all right." Alma had said, "I believe I will be. I have been afraid for a long time and I am less afraid now. That is a significant improvement." The wedding at First Methodist, performed by Pastor Garfield with evident and genuine pleasure, was attended by most of Harlan Creek, because small towns have a strong appetite for celebrations that involve people they have come to like. And Clyde Alden had, in 7 months as marshal, become a person the town had come to like substantially. And Louise had been a person the town valued from the moment she arrived, even when she was entangled in the disastrous Fletcher Dalton situation. The schoolhouse children, all 12 of them, stood in a group near the front of the church and were watched over by Eugenia Holt, who was wearing her best dress and crying from the beginning of the ceremony. Not from sadness, but from the deep emotional responsiveness that long observation of the human heart produces. Clyde looked at Louise through the ceremony with an expression that was not the performance of a man being moved, but the actual state of being moved, contained and certain and entirely present. Louise looked at him with an expression that people who knew her recognized as distinctly hers, the expression of someone who has thought about something carefully for a long time and arrived at a conclusion that is precisely correct. Pastor Garfield said, at one point, that he was particularly glad to be performing this ceremony rather than the one he had been asked to perform in November, and that he wanted to note that the courage of one person in a cold doorway on a winter night had been the beginning of considerable justice in the town of Harlan Creek, and that it seemed to him that things had worked out as they should. Clyde put the second ring on Louise's finger, plain gold to match the engagement ring, and she felt the weight of it, familiar and new at once. The celebration afterward was at the hotel, where the cook had been persuaded to make something more ambitious than usual, And there was dancing because Mrs. Holt's husband had a fiddle and two of the hands from the Hicks Ranch, had a guitar and a harmonica between them. And the floor of the hotel dining room was not ideal for dancing, but became adequate through enthusiasm. Louise danced with her husband for the first time in the hotel dining room of Harlan Creek, Wyoming Territory, on a warm June evening in 1880, 1 year after she had stepped off the stage with her carpet bag and her folded letter. And she thought that the distance between that arrival and this moment was not a straight line at all, but was instead the kind of proof that mathematics occasionally produces that seems impossible, until you follow each step carefully and find that it is, in fact, exactly right. The first years of their marriage were good years, years with the particular quality of a life being built deliberately by two people who understand what they are building and why. They lived in a house on the edge of town, a small house that was cold in winter and leaked a little when it rained hard, and that Clyde repaired and improved methodically over the first 2 years until it stopped leaking and stopped being as cold, and that Louise made into a home with the books she sent for from St. Louis, and the rugs she made in the evenings, and the garden she planted in the spring of 1881, the first garden she had had since her father's house in Missouri. In the winter of 1881, Louise discovered she was expecting a child, and told Clyde on a November evening with the snow coming down outside and the fire going well and both of them at the kitchen table. Him, with a report he was writing, and her, with the letter she had been drafting to his sister in Ohio, whom she had been corresponding with since the wedding. She said simply, "I am going to have a baby," and he looked up from his report and was very still for a moment, and then he stood up and came around the table and held her, and she felt him exhale against the top of her head, a long, slow breath, the breath of someone setting something down. He said into her hair, "Are you well?" She said, "I am very well." He said, "Good." He held her for another moment. Then he said, "I am very happy." She said, "So am I." And then, because she could not always help it, she said, "I calculated it ought to be spring." He pulled back enough to look at her face. "You calculated it," she said, "approximately late March or early April." He said, "Of course you did." And the smile was the full one, the unguarded one, and she felt it like a gift she was always slightly surprised to receive even after 2 years. The baby arrived in the last week of March, 1882, a boy, and they named him James, for her father, the county clerk who had believed in education and left her a library. James Alden was born in the house on the edge of town with Mrs. Holt in attendance and Clyde in the kitchen trying to be useful and not managing it particularly well but being present, which Louise would later say was the important thing. When he came into the room and she put the baby in his arms for the first time, she watched his face very carefully, the way she always watched faces when she was learning something important, and what she saw was everything she had hoped to see and nothing she had needed to worry about. He held James with the careful competence he brought to everything, and looked at this small, new, indignant person with gray eyes that were going to be, she could already tell, the same gray as his father's, and she thought, with the mathematical clarity that never entirely left her, "This is correct. This is exactly correct." Harlan Creek grew in the early 1880s, the way frontier towns grew when the land around them proved productive, and the railroad extended its reach into the territory. New families arrived. The school doubled in enrollment, and Louise hired an assistant teacher, a young woman from Denver named Clara Haynes, who was practical and capable and reminded Louise slightly of herself, which she took as a good sign. The marshal's office acquired a deputy because Clyde needed one, and Clyde chose him with the same care he brought to everything, interviewing 4 candidates and selecting a young man from Texas named Aaron Webb, who was honest and smart and willing to be told things he did not yet know, which Clyde identified as the most important qualification. The town built a new church to replace the first wooden one, and a bank, and a proper hotel with a second floor, And by 1884, Harlan Creek had the feeling of permanence, of a place that had decided to stay. Alma Dalton, whose property rights case had eventually resolved in her favor through a long and complicated legal process that Clyde had assisted with where he could and Louise had followed with intense interest, had remarried in 1882, a man named Gareth Forster who ran the sawmill outside of town, and who, by all available evidence, was exactly what he appeared to be, which was a quiet, hard-working, straightforwardly decent person. Alma had brought him to Sunday supper at Clyde and Louise's house in the spring of 1883, and Louise had liked him immediately, because he listened when Alma spoke with the actual attention of someone who found what she was saying interesting, and that was the thing she always checked first. Fletcher Dalton had served his year in the territorial prison and had, upon release, left Wyoming Territory entirely, heading south, and none of the subsequent news of him was the town's concern. Louise did not think about him much. When she did think about him, it was less with anger, which had largely burned away, than with the particular observation that some people are a test more than they are a person, a test of whether you will let what is wrong stand because standing against it is difficult. She was glad she had not. In the spring of 1884, Louise discovered she was expecting again, and calculated late October. She told Clyde on the same November kitchen table they had been sharing for 4 years, this time with James, now too, asleep in the next room and a lamp burning low between them. Clyde said, "Are you well?" she said, "the same question as last time." He said, "The same answer will be given to the same question indefinitely. I would like to know," she said. "I am very well." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the gesture unhurried and deliberate, the way everything he did was unhurried and deliberate, and she turned her hand over under his and held it. He said, "I love you," she said. "I love you too." He said, "I love our son, and I love this house, and I love this town that should not work but does, and I love the fact that you replaced my curtains without asking." She said, "They were terrible curtains." He said, "They were terrible curtains," he agreed. "I loved you for replacing them without asking because it meant you had already decided to be in my life," she said. "I had decided in February in the Cottonwood Valley." He said, "I know. I had decided in November in the church doorway." She looked at him. "Before you knew anything about me." He said, "I knew you were in the cold and cold was a problem with a solution. And I knew you looked like a person who was trying to do something important and needed not to freeze to death first." "Those things were enough to decide to try," she said, "to try." He said, "The rest was discovering that what I had decided to try for was better than I had understood. That kept happening. It still keeps happening." Louise looked at Clyde Alden across the kitchen table in the lamplight of their house in Harlan Creek, Wyoming Territory, in the spring of 1884, 5 years after a cold November night and a church doorway and a coat, and she thought about the mathematics of a life, the way each element builds on what came before, the way the proof of something is not always visible until the end when you can follow each step backward and see that the logic was sound all the way through. She thought about the secret she had carried across Piney Creek in the dark, and about Alma with her reddish hair and her dark-circled eyes, and about Carrie Marsh who had gone back to Nebraska and written, once, a letter of grateful thanks that Louise had kept. She thought about a pastor in a cold church who had taken a set of documents and done what was right with them. She thought about 12 children learning long division in a schoolhouse, and the Hicks boy who had needed help with reading, and the February cottonwood silver against the snow. She thought about the first morning she had walked to school in Harlan Creek and felt the particular loneliness of a person who is doing good work in an uncertain situation and has no one to come home to, and about the first morning after the February ride when she had walked to school feeling the opposite of that, feeling the warmth of someone's regard like a room with a fire in it, the knowledge that the fire would be there when she came home. She thought about the coat. She said, "You were already unbuttoning your coat when you came up the steps, before you even got a look at my face." He said, You were shivering. She said, You had to have seen me from some distance to be that far along. He said, I noticed you from across the street. He paused. You were very thoroughly wet and very cold, and you were holding yourself together with very little to spare. That was visible from across the street, she said, and that was enough to start unbuttoning the coat. He said, It seemed obvious. If someone is cold and you have a coat and you are warm enough to spare it, you give the coat. The rest is just acting on the obvious thing, she said. Most people do not act on the obvious thing. He said, I know, I have never understood that. She looked at him for another moment, this man who acted on the obvious thing, who sent the reports he said he would send and kept the appointments he said he would keep, and said the important things plainly, and held her hand on cold porches and built a house that did not leak and chose deputies carefully, and loved their son with the same contained, absolute quality he brought to everything. She said, Neither have I. The October baby was a girl, born on a clear, cold morning with the aspens already gone gold and the mountains hard and blue in the distance, and they named her Margaret, for Clyde's mother in Ohio, who had written such a warm letter upon the news of the engagement that Louise had read it 3 times and kept it with the important letters. Margaret was born with a great deal of strong opinion about the world, which she expressed immediately and at volume, and Clyde held her in the delivery room with an expression that was, Mrs. Holt reported later to anyone who would listen, the single most tender thing she had seen a man's face do in 40 years of watching faces. James was allowed to come in and see his sister when she was an hour old, and he regarded her with the serious interest of a 2-year-old encountering something new and unexpected, reached out and touched her very small hand with one finger and said, with great gravity, She has got hair. She did indeed have hair dark like her mother's. Clyde said, She does. James thought about this. Does she know things yet? Clyde said. She will learn. James said, I can teach her long division. Louise said from the bed, with her eyes still closed but with an expression of pure happiness, She will appreciate that enormously. The years settled into the good rhythm of a life that knows what it is. Harlan Creek grew and Louise taught, and Clyde kept the peace with the particular combination of honesty and patience that the town had come to understand was the specific quality of their marshal. Not rough or imposing, but reliable in the way. A well-built structure is reliable, not because it has never been tested, but because the testing has confirmed the soundness of the construction. James learned to ride and to read and to do mathematics in his mother's kitchen. And Margaret, as she grew from infant to toddler to small girl with strong opinions and dark hair and gray eyes, turned out to have a ferocious aptitude for numbers that delighted Louise and did not surprise Clyde at all, who said simply that it made sense. In the summer of 1888, when James was 6 and Margaret was 3, and Harlan Creek had a new hotel and a telegraph office and a proper bank, and a school with 3 teachers, Louise's sister from Missouri came to visit, bringing with her 2 of Louise's nieces, and the particular disruption that visiting relatives produce in a household, which was welcome and stimulating and exhausting in equal measure. Louise's sister, Catherine, was a narrow, sharp-eyed woman with a quick laugh and very decided views, and she studied Clyde across the supper table on the first evening with the intensity of someone performing a thorough assessment. And then she turned to Louise and said, in the direct family manner that ran in the Bailey women, He is exactly what you said. Louise said, What did I say? Catherine said, You said he was a man who meant what he said and said what he meant and did not perform either of those things. You were exactly right. It is unusual. Clyde said from his end of the table, I can hear you. Catherine said, I intended you to. I wanted you to know I approve. He said, I appreciate that. Catherine said, You should. I am very selective. Louise caught Clyde's eye across the table, and the look they exchanged was the particular look of 2 people who have spent 8 years building a private language of small signals, quick, warm, specific, and fully understood. After Catherine left, taking the nieces and the stimulating disruption with her, The house settled back into its own rhythms, the particular rhythms of a household with 2 children and 2 working parents, and a sufficient number of books and a good stove and a garden that produced enthusiastically every summer. On an August evening, with the windows open to the warm night air and the children in bed and the dishes done, they sat on the small porch of the house on the edge of Harlan Creek and watched the last of the light go out of the western sky, the mountains dark against it, and the stars coming out one by one. Louise said, after a long, comfortable silence, "Do you remember the church doorway?" He said. "Of course," she said. "I did not even hear you on the steps." "I was so cold I had stopped hearing properly," he said. "You were very far gone," she said. "When I felt the coat, I thought for a moment I had imagined it." He said, "I wondered afterward if I should have said something first. Introduced myself before putting my coat on a stranger," she said. "No, if you had introduced yourself first I would have said no. I was in a state where accepting something from someone I knew I would have to deal with further would have felt like too much. The coat first was correct." He thought about this. "You have analyzed it," she said. "Many times it is what I do." He said, "And what is the conclusion of the analysis?" she said. "That you acted on the obvious thing as you always do. And that sometimes the obvious thing is exactly right, and that I am very glad you were walking past that church on that particular night." He said, "I am very glad you were standing in that doorway." She said, "I was not glad about it at the time." He said, "No, but the things we are most glad about afterward are usually the things we were not glad about at the time." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the way she had for 8 years, and he put his arm around her, the way he had for 8 years, and the Wyoming night was warm and full of stars, and the mountains were dark and solid at the end of the valley, and the town of Harlan Creek was quiet below them, keeping its peace. She said, "Clyde." He said, "Louise," she said, "I think there is going to be another one." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" She said, "Very well. I calculated April." He said, "Of course you did," and she could hear the smile in it, the full one, the unguarded one. She said, "There will come a point at which you will stop being surprised that I calculate things." He said, "That point will not come. I will be surprised every time, and I will love you for it every time." She turned her head enough to look at him in the faint starlight, the gray eyes that she knew as well as anything she had ever known, the face that was slightly older now and slightly more weathered from Wyoming winters and was entirely itself in every important way. She said, "I love you," he said. "I love you." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, slow and deliberate, the way he did everything. Every day more than the day before, which mathematically is straightforward, but I mean it in the less quantifiable sense as well. She laughed, the quick, genuine laugh, and held it for a moment after. The April baby arrived on schedule, with Louise's typical precision. On the 3rd of April, 1889, the same year Wyoming would become a state, the territorial era giving way to something new and more formal, though the mountains and the sky and the creek in the valley were the same as they had always been and always would be. The baby was a boy, and they named him Robert, and he arrived with a great deal of dark hair like his mother and a composed expression like his father, and James, now 7, came in to see him and said, with the authority of older sibling experience, "He is smaller than Margaret was." Louise said, "He is exactly the right size." James considered this. "He looks like he is thinking about something." Clyde said, "He might be." James said, "I hope he thinks about mathematics." "We could use another one who thinks about mathematics." Margaret, 3 years old and already formidably verbal, said, from the doorway where she was being held by Mrs. Holt, who had been present for all 3 births and showed no sign of being any less moved by this one than the previous 2, "I think about mathematics." James said, "You are learning to count." Margaret said with great dignity, "I can count to 100. Clyde said, "She can count to 100 and she can do simple addition. I taught her last week." James looked at his father with an expression of brotherly justice. "You taught her?" Clyde said. "She asked." James processed this. Then he said, with the philosophical resignation of someone learning that the world is not waiting for him to be ready. "All right, I will teach her the rest when she is older." Louise, from the bed, with Robert asleep on her chest, and the Wyoming spring afternoon coming through the window with the smell of cottonwood and new grass, said, "Both of you will teach Robert when he is ready." James and Margaret looked at each other, a complex sibling transaction conducted in about 2 seconds of eye contact, and then they looked at Robert on their mother's chest. And the thing that happened in their faces was so young and so new and so essentially human that Mrs. Holt, watching from the doorway, made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, but was the thing that exists between those two states when the heart is too full for either one individually. Clyde came and sat on the edge of the bed and put his hand on Robert's small back and looked at Louise with the gray eyes and the contained expression and the full, unguarded thing underneath it. She said quietly, so only he could hear, "Look at what we built." He said, "I see it." She said, "It started with a coat." He said, "It started before that. It started with you deciding to do the right thing and walking across a creek in a blizzard to do it." She said, "The coat was better." He said, "The coat was the beginning of being able to help the rest of it happen. You were already doing the right thing. I just made sure you did not freeze before you finished." She looked at him. "That is possibly the most accurate description of what you have been doing for 9 years." He said, "Is it not enough?" She said, "It is everything. You know it is everything." He did know. He had known, she thought, from the beginning, from the moment on the church steps when he had looked at a wet, shaking, determined stranger, and seen not a problem or a damsel, but a person who was trying to accomplish something important and was going to accomplish it regardless, and had simply offered what was useful and stood beside her while she did it. That was what it was, in the end. Not rescue and not heroism and not the performance of either. Just standing beside someone, coat first, while they did what they had already decided to do. Just being the person who saw the obvious thing and did it, who meant what he said and said what he meant, who loved without performance and stayed without condition and grew, year by year and season by season and child by child, into exactly what he had always been but more fully expressed, more fully known, more fully himself. And she who had come to Harlan Creek with a carpetbag and a folded letter and the specific loneliness of someone doing good work with no one to come home to, had come home. Robert grew. And James grew, and Margaret grew, and Harlan Creek grew, and Wyoming became a state, and the world changed around them in all the ways the world changes. The telegraph and eventually the telephone being talked about in the East, the railroad reaching new places and bringing new people, the frontier becoming less frontier and more settled with each passing year. But the house on the edge of Harlan Creek stayed the house on the edge of Harlan Creek, with its repaired roof, and its good stove and its library that grew each year, with new volumes ordered from St. Louis and later from Chicago, and the garden that produced every summer, and the porch where they sat on warm nights and watched the stars come out. Louise taught until 1893, when the school had grown large enough and had enough teachers that she decided, at 38, to take on a different kind of work, setting up what she called a correspondence program for women in outlying homesteads who could not get to town regularly, sending books and lesson materials, and receiving back letters with questions that she answered carefully and fully. It was not a paying position, but it was, she told Clyde, the most interesting teaching she had ever done, because the students were so particular about what they wanted to know, so specific in their hunger for the information they had decided they needed, the way adults are when they have chosen their learning freely. Clyde remained marshal of Harlan Creek for 22 years, which was not a record for frontier lawmen but was a substantial tenure by any measure. And when he retired in 1902 at the age of 52, the town held a celebration in the hotel dining room, the same room where he and Louise had danced at their wedding. And it had more guests than it had had then because Harlan Creek had more people and they all knew him. And the things that were said about him in the speeches were the things that are said about a person who has actually done the thing they were trusted to do, not the ceremonial things said about positions, but the real things said about character. He was not comfortable with the speeches. Louise watched him accept them with the careful courtesy of a man who finds public sentiment difficult to receive gracefully and is trying his best, and she caught his eye across the room and he gave her the look, the quick, warm, private signal of their shared language, and she gave it back and it meant, "I know, almost over. You are doing fine." Margaret, 20 years old by the celebration and possessed of both her mother's mathematical aptitude and a driving interest in studying law. The Wyoming women's suffrage history of 1869 having made the question of women's legal standing in the territory something she found personally consequential. Stood up in the hotel dining room and gave a speech about her father that made Louise cry and made Clyde press his mouth together in the way he pressed it together when he was feeling a great deal and was not going to perform it. She said that the definition of integrity was what you did when no one was watching, and that her father had always done the same thing whether anyone was watching or not, and that she had learned by observation that this was rarer than it should be and more important than it might look. James, 22 and helping run the Hicks family ranch now, having discovered at 15 that land and cattle were what interested him, gave a shorter speech that said essentially, "My father taught me to do the obvious thing." "It sounds simple," he said, "but watch most people and you will see that it is the hardest thing there is." Robert, 13, did not give a speech but sat beside his mother through the evening and at one point leaned against her shoulder and said quietly, "Are you happy, Mama?" She said, "Very happy." He said, "Good." And then after a moment, "Papa looks uncomfortable." She said, "He is. He does not like speeches." Robert said, "But he is staying for them." She said, "He always stays for the important things." Robert thought about this with the seriousness of 13. Then he nodded. Later, when the speeches were done and the dancing had started and the hotel was full of the generous noise of a community celebrating itself, Clyde found Louise at the edge of the room and stood beside her, shoulders touching, watching the dancers. He said, "Your daughter was trying to make me cry." She said, "My daughter has excellent judgment." He said, "She is going to be a lawyer." She said, "I know, I am very proud." He said, "So am I." He took her hand. "Shall we dance?" She said, "You retired today. Are you not exhausted?" He said, "I am 52 years old and I have been doing the same job for 22 years and the job is done, and I am standing in a room full of people we know and you are next to me. I am the least exhausted I have been in years." She looked at him, and the gray eyes were the same gray as always, the face more lined and the hair more silver but entirely itself. And she thought that the sum of 22 years of a life shared with someone is not simply the accumulation of years, but the way each year has layered onto the previous ones, deepening and clarifying. The way a valley is made by the work of water over time, shaped by the patient, consistent action of the thing that loves it. She said, "Yes, let us dance." They danced in the hotel dining room of Harlan Creek, Wyoming, in 1902, the same room where they had danced at their wedding 22 years before. And it was not a young dance, and it was not performed for anyone. And it was simply two people who knew each other very well moving together in a familiar space with the music of a community they had built themselves. And it was as close to perfect as a moment can be when you know how to recognize perfection, which is not the absence of anything, but the presence of everything that matters. Outside, Harlan Creek went about its night, the oil lamps giving way in some of the newer establishments to electric light that had recently arrived on the lines from Cheyenne, the creek running dark over its stones in the valley, the mountains enormous and permanent at the end of it, the stars above the same stars they had always been. The same stars that had been above the church doorway on a November night in 1879, when a woman was shivering in the cold, and a man was already unbuttoning his coat before she noticed. She had been cold, and he had had a coat, and it had seemed obvious. Everything that followed had followed from that, from the willingness to act on the obvious thing, from the courage to carry documents across a creek in a blizzard, from a pastor who did what was right when it was difficult, from a marriage record in Laramie, and a woman named Alma with reddish hair and dark-circled eyes who had said, "I thought he would have told you by now," with the gentleness of someone who is done waiting for things that are not coming. From 12 children learning long division in a cold schoolhouse. From a water rights dispute and a barn fire and a very long effort at justice. From a ring with a turquoise stone the color of the Wyoming sky. From James and Margaret and Robert, who were their own people with their own lives beginning. From 22 years of doing the obvious thing together, the same thing whether anyone was watching or not. Louise Bailey Alden danced with her husband in the light and the music and the warm November room, and outside the territory that was no longer a territory, but a state turned its slow, enormous face toward winter, and the creek ran and the mountain stood, and the stars came out one by one, and the year moved forward as it always does toward whatever comes next, which is unknown and will be met, when it arrives, with whatever can be brought to it, which is and has always been enough.